Today, I'll be introducing you to my freshly built 4K gaming budget PC, which you could buy the parts for and put together for just shy of $750. This isn't the usual 4K budget build, however. With this PC, I won't be scraping by with medium settings and 45 FPS. My goal was for this computer to keep around 60 FPS in 4K with ultra settings, without breaking the bank. I'll show you which parts I bought, where I bought them, and how this PC really performs. Let's get started. Here is a picture of all of the parts that I purchased, so let's go through each part and figure out how much it cost and where I got it. This is the graphics card I chose. It's an NVIDIA GTX 1080 Ti, and it's one of the best 4K cards that you can get right now, especially for the money. I bought this one on Reddit's hardware swap forum for $385 with shipping. You'll notice that this makes up more than half of the price of our build, but trust me, it's worth it. This is our CPU, the Ryzen 1600AF. This is a powerful multi-threaded 6-core CPU that can run gaming and productivity things pretty well, especially considering that it only costs $85. So we'll see how it compares to our extremely powerful GTX 1080 Ti. Here is the RAM. AMD Ryzen processors need fast RAM in order to run at their full potential, so I made sure to buy 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3000, and this only cost $65 on Amazon. Next up is our SSD, or solid state drive, which is the fastest storage inside of the system and is used to boot Windows. I bought this Crucial M4 256GB model for only $25 on Reddit's hardware swap forum. This is our hard drive. It's a 3TB model that runs at the usual 7200 RPM. I bought it on eBay for $37.99. Up next is the motherboard. This is an ASRock board on the B450M chipset, and it's MATX, so it fits in a whole lot of cases. I bought this professionally refurbished on Amazon Warehouse for $55. The power supply, although pretty inexpensive, is a very important part, and it needs to be able to supply enough power for all of the components to run well. I bought this 500-watt unit on Amazon from EVGA for only $47.49. The final part to mention is the case. This one is a Cooler Master HAF that I already owned, so I repurposed it for this project. To buy a case would have cost me about $45, but I didn't need to. Here are our total costs. It only cost me $700.48 to build this computer, but for someone who would also need to buy a case, the total would rise to about $745.48, still under our $750 threshold, and well capable of 4K gaming. Here's what the PC looked like inside after I had finished the build. Notice that there's lots of extra space left over, and this build would be perfectly comfortable in a much smaller case. This was one of the smoothest and easiest builds that I've ever done, and it booted up and started running first try with no problems. Once the build was finished, it was time for me to begin benchmarking. Let's see just how powerful this computer really is. The first benchmark that I decided to use was the Unigine Superposition 4K benchmark. This benchmark is designed for testing and comparing 4K gaming PCs, and it provides all sorts of really intensive scenes, lighting effects, and textures. You will notice that even though this is a very difficult benchmark to run, and it's running in 4K, this PC is still pulling very high frame rates, especially for the type of benchmark that this is. On the 4K superposition benchmark, this PC scored 8,652, with an average frame rate of 64.71 frames per second. The GPU stayed at a pretty good temperature, only going up to 84 degrees Celsius, which is usual for a blower card, and it was utilized all the way up to 100%. These results are very good, especially for a computer that only cost around $700. The next benchmark that I chose to run was 3DMark TimeSpy. TimeSpy is known to be a very demanding benchmark for gaming PCs and is designed specifically to cater to gamers. So let's take a look at how well this PC performed. This benchmark has lots of particle effects and all sorts of things going on screen at the same time, but this PC still managed to pull through at a great frame rate. This benchmark also directly tests CPU performance, so it'll be perfect for comparing our CPU with our GPU to see if we can truly match an $85 processor to a GPU that costs $385. These are the results of the TimeSpy benchmark. In both graphics tests, the GTX 1080 Ti scored nearly 60 FPS. And our CPU score is close enough to our GPU score, 6090 versus 9200, for those two components to be considered a good match. After benchmarking, I decided to test some actual 4K gameplay. The first game that I played was The Forest. Even though this title released back in 2014, it's had graphical updates since then, and is a very difficult game to run at ultra settings. In 4K, I managed to stay above 50 FPS the entire time, even with the thick vegetation, physics simulations, lighting effects, and extremely high resolution textures. Areas in this game with lower amounts of trees, grass, and other vegetation pushed the frame rate up beyond 70 FPS, but heavily wooded areas remained around 53 to 55. With a couple of minor settings lowered, this game could easily be played at a full 60 FPS in 4K on this computer. The next game that I decided to try was Sea of Thieves. Sea of Thieves is a more recent title than The Forest, and although it has a cartoonish style, it also has some of the best lighting and water physics effects available. In 4K, this game is no joke. I played on the highest possible settings and never dipped below 60 FPS, even in areas with thick vegetation and lots of movement. The final game that I used to test frame rates was Rainbow Six Siege. This game has been a staple of competitive PC gaming for a few years now, and players demand a smooth frame rate. Rainbow Six Siege has been lauded for its realistic graphics and high-action gameplay. The Rainbow Six Siege benchmark that I used exhibits the most demanding scenes that the game has to offer. As you can see here, with the built-in Rainbow Six Siege benchmark, 4K with all settings maxed, this PC managed frame rates very close to 60 across the board, with maximums of up to 75. The minimum frame rates only occurred for a split second during scene changes and were not noticeable. It's apparent that this PC offers a fantastic 4K experience with very few compromises. But what about gamers who like to play at lower resolutions and higher frame rates? Can the Ryzen 1600 AF CPU keep up with the GTX 1080 Ti even at lower resolutions? I decided to find out. First, I ran the superposition benchmark again, but this time I ran it at the default medium 1080p settings. The PC scored a jaw-dropping 18,605 points, with an average frame rate of 139.16 FPS. It seems that at least in Unigen superposition, my inexpensive CPU is not much of a limiting factor at all. Next, I replayed The Forest in 1080p, consistently keeping frame rates over 100 FPS the entire time, even with the intense physics effects and the dense vegetation. I also turned Sea of Thieves down to 1080p and decided to run that game again. Sea of Thieves only dropped below 100 FPS a couple of times while walking through densely populated ports. On the water, where most of the game is played, frame rates remained above 150 FPS pretty much all the time, even momentarily reaching beyond 160. These frame rates are far beyond what most monitors are even capable of supporting. Finally, I ran the Rainbow Six Siege benchmark in Ultra at 1080p, scoring an average of 168 FPS over all of the scenes involved. Obviously, using the inexpensive Ryzen 1600 AF did not cause lower frame rates even when resolution was dropped. Also keep in mind that these benchmarks were recorded while running, and the scores would have been slightly higher than what you see if I had run these benchmarks without recording at the same time. As a final disclaimer, I did overclock the Ryzen 1600 AF to 3.85 GHz at 1.2 volts, but didn't want to push beyond that value while using the stock cooler. Temperatures never pass 70 degrees even with the overclock. Any 1600 AF should easily be able to handle these same clock and voltage settings without any hiccups, and it's something that you could do simply in your own computer. Even if the CPU had not been overclocked, the scores would have been within a few percentage points of what I showed, and in 4K there would have been probably no noticeable difference whatsoever. Overall, I think this build was a fantastic success. Now, if you want to see my video on using Reddit to find great deals on PCs, like what I did for this computer, or you want to learn my formula for building great PCs at nearly any budget, click on these other videos. And always remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy the content.